Hello and welcome once again to Harry's little Jeti clinic. In this video we're going to be looking at the sort of settings you might use in Essential Box 200, and I shall be using with it the Jeti Remote Satellite RSat-2. I understand that in North America they don't import these, they get the receiver 3, but a lot of the general concepts are going to be the same. So I find it easier to bind the remotes outside of the model because you're not having to fiddle around trying to get bind plugs and stuff in. It's pretty straightforward. Take the first one, put the bind plug into the X port, and go into your menus, Advanced Properties, Wireless Modes Trainer. The mode will not be the default one, it will be double path. Say OK to that. Now we're ready to pair the primary module, which is this one with the bind plug. So we can stick the battery in. Really use this receiver? Yes. Thank you. That's the first one done. Remove the battery. Little bind plug.
Signal lost.
Yes, dear.
Signal lost.
Go to your second one.
Signal lost. Signal lost. Signal lost. Signal lost.
And we'll come down to
Signal lost.
this one.
Signal lost.
Get that going. Plug in. Really use this receiver. Yes.
Signal lost.
And that's it done.
Signal lost.
Just signal lost because we've
Signal
switched
lost.
the primary one off.
Signal lost.
If I remove the bind plug from that
Signal
one,
lost.
plug a battery,
Signal lost.
another battery into the other one.
Signal lost.
There we go. Both RSATs up and running. Look down here, alarm at loss of any receiver. If it loses one, I'd rather have other things tell me that this going off. I can set up alarms in the normal way. So I prefer, instead of loss of any of the one receiver, I'd like to know of a loss of both receivers. The options are loss of any, in other words, either one of them, loss of receiver 1, loss of receiver 2, don't know why you'd want either of those two alone, but there you go, or loss of both. So I always choose loss of both. And you would choose that, of course, should you be using the 24 channel. This is a DS16. So, okay to that. Let's have a look inside Device Explorer before we plug it into the CB200. There's our RSAT. It's number 1. Right, serial link PPM positive out. This is where you can choose your various bits and pieces. I think I'm choosing X bus and PPM positive because I'm going to use the X port. I'm not quite sure if this just refers to the PPM port, but anyway, I'll choose X bus for the X port. Apply changes, yes. And look down here, general settings, output period. For an RSAT, I want the output to be auto. Is it that way? No, it's down the way. There we go. You think, no, you want something like 20 milliseconds for your analog servos. This doesn't get servos plugged into it. This is just talking to the CB200. You will set the real output period for your servos in the CB200. So have that running that way in auto. PPM settings, we're not bothered about those because that's to do with the PPM socket, which at the moment I'm powering with the battery, but we'll actually be connecting the EXT socket once we're in the model. Alarm settings. Do you want a low voltage alarm? It's up to you. You can turn that well off if you need to. Say OK. We need to go back in and have a look at failsafe. That should be off. Disabled. Good. It can obviously be enabled, and you can set all your failsafes, or disabled. You must set this to disabled. What we'll be doing is setting the failsafes in the CB200. The reason is, if you set fail-safes in this, and this loses signal, you want it to swap the CB200 to swap over to using this one. But if you've set fail-safes in this one, it will continue generating valid signals, i.e. the fail-safes that you've set. So your model will go into fail-safe, even though this one might be operating quite happily. So, disabled. OK to that. Keeps jumping out. And receiver outputs, we can leave them as they are. Again, it's just set up with the model. We wouldn't remap these. You can remap things within the CB200. Don't do it within the RSAT. OK, that's that one set. Come into this one, and we just do the same again. Serial link, XBus and PPM pause. Yes. Again, that's for the X port. So I'm going to be using the XBus to talk from the X port on the RSAT to the receiver port on the CB200. General settings again, come down here, I'll set that to auto. I don't need any of those, happy with that. Come back, fail-safe must be disabled, back. And the receiver outputs, there's nothing to do there. Okie doke. So that's the basic setup for the RSATs, or I believe your R3 receiver would be similar sort of things. Okay, let's have a look at the sort of settings we'd use in an actual model. And for this, I'm going to be using my beautiful assistant today. No, not the Phantom, but this Carf Eurosport, painted in the colours of a Eurofighter Typhoon of the Royal Air Force 2015 Special Display Scheme, which was painted to represent a Hurricane of certain Flight Lieutenant Nicholson of the Battle of Britain, who won a Victoria Cross. So it has a Central Box 200 in it, as do almost all my jets. If they haven't got a CB200, they've either got a CB400 or, as we saw in one of the Sabres, an R12 with an RSAT. And let's take a look inside the settings then. Go into Model, into Device Explorer. There's our two RSATs, and under the RSAT is the Central Box 200, and under that is an M-bar. This is one of the newer M-bars, which is an EX bus. If you look at my videos about the various things like gear safe and whatnot, I use an older M-bar, which is not an X bus one. So, Central Box 200, in we go. Fairly straightforward. General settings, output period. This is where we set the rapidity of the signal sent to the servos. Remember, we set it to auto in the RSATs. This is what determines what gets sent to the servos. There's a couple of analog servos in the Typhoon, so I've left it at 17. Come down here, the expander settings. There's an expander port, and so I've set that to XBus, so I've been able to plug in the M bar. And switchover strategy. Now this is important. This came out in one of the, I think possibly the most recent update to the Central Box 200, because some of the Jeti fans, who are very sort of electronically and data signal knowledgeable, discovered that if it wasn't getting a signal from receiver 1, it didn't simply check receiver 2 to see a good signal and use that. Sorry about that quick jump there. My lovely wife just brought me out my afternoon coffee and a chocolate hobnob. Lovely. So let's carry on. Yes, they found that the Central Box was not switching between receivers as people expected it would do. You'd think it would just check receiver 1, receiver 2. If the signal's valid on receiver 1, use that. If receiver 1 had an invalid signal due to interference, shielding, blocking, whatever, it would just use the data off receiver 2 if receiver 2 is good. Well, it wasn't. It was sitting on receiver 1 for quite a relatively long time. We're not talking seconds, we're still talking fractions of seconds, but it was still going through an awful lot of invalid data frames on receiver 1. before it would finally switch over to receiver 2. And let's say it got one valid frame on receiver 2, then spotted on the next frame that receiver 1 was valid again, it jumped straight back to receiver 1, which could then go invalid again for a long, relatively long period. Again, we're talking fractions of a second. And then, in theory, it could sort of jump to receiver 2 for one valid frame, back to receiver 1 for one valid frame, and then have an awful lot of invalid frames on receiver 1 before this process would repeat. So you could end up with a terrible, in effect, signal to noise ratio, almost all noise to signal. And those who knew what they were doing with these things, came up with the data and complained about it. And Jeti, always credit to Jeti, they listen to what they're told, and if it's good, they act upon it, and they did. So one of the last updates brought out this new thing called switchover strategy, and I've set it to mixing, and mixing pretty much does what you expect. If it's an invalid signal on receiver 1, it switches to receiver 2 straight away. And, I'm not sure if it sits there on receiver 2 until it has to go back to 1, but at least if it goes back to 1 and then gets another invalid frame, it'll go straight back to receiver 2. So your options there are timeout at 80 milliseconds or 150 milliseconds. I think that means how long receiver 1 is allowed to get invalid data before it times out and switches over to receiver 2. Choose mixing. That's the good one. Okie doke. Out of here. Alternative pin config. This is that same thing where you can choose other outputs for the pins. Down here we get pin 14 and 15 on your CB200 can be expander ports for telemetry stuff, etc. So I've still got servo at pin 14, but at pin 15 I've selected that to be a telemetry input because I've got quite a few sensors in this model. Okay, nice and easy stuff again. Into your servo failsafe. Remember I said in the RSAT, disable the failsafe. Your failsafe must be done here in the CB200. So failsafe is enabled. If I remember rightly, Jeti defaults to 1.5 seconds as a failsafe delay. You set it to what you want. My personal preference is half a second. You set it where you wish. I just feel that, 1.5 seconds in a jet is a long time not to have any control over it and not go into failsafe either. So, half a second for me. And it shows all your out pins with the values that it's stored. So you put the controls where you want and press the button to say set the failsafe positions now. And that's that. Servo output mapping. Yeah. You can map the incoming channel to a different pin. So at the moment, pin 1, or socket 1 if you like, is getting channel 1. Pin 2 is getting channel 2, pin 3 getting channel 3. You can map these around as you wish. It might be, you might think it's easier actually just to swap the servo assignments in the basic model screen of your transmitter, move them around channels rather than try remapping in here, because you could then get confused as to which servo is plugged in where. Remember, if you look at your servo assignments screen and you think, oh, that servo's buzzing a bit, I need to pull that out and replace it, and you look in your servo assignments screen and it says it's channel 3. You forget that in here you've mapped channel 3 into out pin 5. So you come over here and you pull out the servo in pin 3 and think, why is the dodgy servo still working? I've just unplugged it. So it can be useful. There are times this is good though. For instance, in the English Electric Lightning I have has a central box 400 up front, and I use a Jeti X-Bus data bus to carry all the data down to a central box 100 in the tail. But of course it gets all 24 channels down in the tail, and the central box 100 is only a 7 output. I've got 5 servos there, and therefore I can map all the incoming channels that I actually need in the tail into the correct output sockets on those. Group is basically when is the data to be sent to the servo. There's 3 groups in effect. Group A, servos, all get their data sent at the same time. Group B servos then get their data sent. Group C servos get their data sent. And so it's a way, for instance, if you have a couple of ganged servos, that it's really important that to the fractions of a second they basically move together rather than slightly apart. You can set them to be the same group, and that way they both get their signal to move at the same time. Okay. And then telemetry just tells you what's actually going live at the moment. And the telemetry min-max tells you what's been the minimum and maximum that's going on. Okay. Let's have a look at what we can do with all this data. Go into our timer sensors, displayed telemetry. The one I always like is setting antenna. And because I've got 2 receivers going on it, the 2 RSATs, say yes to double, and then it looks like this. So each receiver gets a row. So receiver 1, aerial 1, 9. Remember that the receiver scores are out of 9, so it's 9 out of 9, 9 out of 9, data quality 100%. And there's the second, A3 and A4. And as usual, you can do displayed telemetry with a central box, the voltage in plug 1 and the voltage in plug 2. I happen to be running my central box from PowerBox Gemini, so they should blooming well be the same. And then you can do all the usual, the voice outputs. I use the single voice announcements. As always, ping my spring-loaded switch away.
Signal 100%.
And I've got nothing set, pulling it back towards me at the moment. I'm not too bothered about any more on this one. You can set your alarms. You can set an alarm for each input, power input into the central box. Clearly, if the PowerBox Gemini was to fail, which I think would be an event to write in the calendar if a PowerBox item failed, they're both going to go to 0 at the same time. But if say one of them got unplugged, the wire broke, whatever, each one individually is going to go. And I have a feeling, yes, I've got separate voice announcements, and I think this may have come actually default with Jeti. I don't think these are ones I made myself. So if this one happens,
Warning, low voltage A.
Yeah, so if one of them goes off, you don't just get warning low voltage, you get told where it is. Very important that, because I've got obviously low voltage warnings on the transmitter, on the turbine battery, and on the 2 receiver batteries, so it tells you which one's going. And that's pretty much it. Have fun with your Central Box 200s. I like them. See, I've got them in many of my jets and big gliders too, and very good they've been.